The alley smelled of old rain and iron. She was on the pavement on her knees. There was a shoe nearby, a childlike doll with its face rubbed raw. She could feel the cold seeping into her palms through the thin gloves. She tasted copper on her tongue. The street light flickered and then steadied. He stood at the corner like a man who had lost a map. He did not move when she saw him. She knew him. She did not know his name. She knew the way the light hit his cheekbones. She knew the way his coat hung like a promise. She did not know why there was a photograph pinned to the telephone pole. There were faces on the paper, 3 faces. Each face had a small black marker circle beneath the jaw. She had seen the faces in the newspaper. She had seen them on the missing posters taped to grocery store windows. She had seen them in other things that people hide from their mouths. He looked at her. He looked like a neighbor. He looked like someone who had been invited to dinner and then forgotten to leave. He smiled. His smile did not find his eyes. She stood up. Her legs trembled with the memory of running. She had run before. She would run again. The day before the alley was ordinary. She made coffee in a chipped mug. She read the paper with a pen on the corner of the page. She worked in a pharmacy on the edge of town. She knew the names of most of the elderly customers. They called her by a name that ended with a soft consonant. She mended things. She answered questions about pills and about the little things that should not break. She had a cat that slept in the sunlight on the kitchen table. She liked the cat because the cat did not ask anything of her. She lived in a narrow house with peeling paint on Maple Street. Her front window looked onto a lawn that the city let go wild. A porch light that had a cracked glass bulb rocked when trucks passed. This was how normal began. Subtle wrongness arrived as papers left on doormats. A bike with its chain cut and lying like a fallen insect. A sound like a hand sliding along wood in the small hours. At first she told herself that someone else would notice. At first she told herself that someone else would do something. Then the first missing poster appeared on the telephone pole. A woman with a smile that looked like a photograph that had been overexposed. The date was last summer. The contact number had a phone that stopped answering. She smoothed the poster with her palm. She wondered what the woman had been doing the last time she had been standing in the world. She did not know that wondering was a beginning.
The night after the poster, she heard the sound in the hallway. It was a dragging sound like fabric over stone. Her heart pushed against her ribs. She held the spoon in her hand until the ceramic grew cold. She told herself it was the pipes. She told herself that the cat had overturned a jar. She went to sleep with the light on for the first time in years. She woke to the smell, wet rot, and something sweeter under it, like a tin dipped in old blood and left in the sun. She did not go to the hallway for a long time. She told herself she would call the police in the morning. But when morning came, the phone number in the missing poster was crossed out. A new set of posters went up overnight. 2 more faces. One with a scar at the temple. One with a laugh that stopped in photographs. She began to notice the houses on her street in a precise way. The way curtains leaned in their windows. The way door locks had extra scratches around them. The way neighbors put chairs out on their porches and then did not sit in them. A delivery truck parked at the far end of the block arrived earlier every day. A man with wide shoulders stepped out and moved in a slow, purposeful manner. No one from the apartment building spoke to him. No one spoke much at all. Conversations shifted like furniture. They became smaller. They fit the shape of rumor. She found a photograph tucked under her mailbox. It was of a woman in a red scarf. The scarf hid much of the face. Only the eyes gleamed. Someone had circled the mouth with a thick black marker. She turned the picture over. There was nothing on the back. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket like a secret. At work, a young man came in and asked for something to soothe the bruise. He moved as if he were trying to hide the direction he had come from. He had a small ring of dried mud at the hem of his shoe. He told her that his sister was missing. He said the words like a litany that he could not finish. She put labels on bottles and slid them across the counter like a lifeline. He left with a paper bag tucked under his arm. She watched the door until the bell stopped chiming. She thought of the photograph in her pocket and of the woman with the circle at the mouth. She thought of the alley and of the man at the corner. Days passed with the soft cruelty of a clock. She saw him sometimes on the street. He walked as if he were following a route that belonged to the wind. He passed by with a bag of bread, and then later carrying a small jar of preserves. He mowed a lawn in sunlight. He took the trash out in the night. He was in the town like a weather pattern. People nodded but did not ask. They looked away. They arranged their lives with a new carefulness as if danger had become a new kind of furniture. At the newsstand, an article came out with a headline that tried and failed to be cool. Missing women. Pattern emerges. A neighbor speaks. He was interviewed slowly and with the blank face of someone reading a script. He said that he was concerned. He said that he loved this street. The camera lingered on his hands. They had a small tremor when he reached for a cup. She watched the footage at home. She pressed her heel against the floor until it ached. He was in the frame behind the journalist. He stood on the sidewalk, and in one blink his eyes slid to the camera, then away. She swallowed, and a taste of iron filled her mouth. Paranoia is not lightning. Paranoia is a slow fog that settles in on your furniture. It creeps into schedules. It changes the way you breathe. She started waking up at odd hours. She checked door locks 3 times. She put magnets on the windows that made a small jangle whenever they moved. She did not tell anyone about the picture under her pillow. She scratched a series of marks into the inside of her kitchen drawer. Each mark represented a night she had stayed awake. She began to rehearse routes through the house like a child practicing lines. If something knocked, she was ready to be a person who could run. One night something did knock. A dull, slow thudding like a fist tapping underwater. She did not scream. She waited. The sound ceased. She waited longer until the dark outside the window narrowed to a thin strip. Then she moved like a blade. She opened the door, and the hallway was empty. A note lay on the welcome mat like a folded leaf. There was a single word on it. Come. No punctuation. Her breath shortened. She wanted to throw the note away. She wanted to burn it. She folded it into the palm of her hand and crushed it like a threat that could be turned into something less.
The attacks escalated with simple cruelty. A window smashed at dawn. A voice on the phone that hung there like an accusation. The cat vanished for a day and then returned with its fur matted and its eyes like small planets that had been through too many light years. She woke to the sound of running water in the sinks at 3 in the morning. Her hands smelled of bleach and iodine. She found footprints on the threshold as if someone had stood and then chosen not to enter. She heard a laugh one night that was wrong to be outside of a child's mouth. It was thin and filled with other voices. She learned to hold her breath when walking past certain houses. She learned to read the faces of neighbors like torn pages. One afternoon she followed him. She told herself she would not. She told herself she was only curious. He moved through streets that looped. He kept his head down like a man carrying shame. He stopped at a small park and sat on a bench. She watched him from a bus shelter. He took out a sandwich and ate slowly. He chewed with a small ritual attention. His jaw worked in an almost pleasant rhythm. A woman with a stroller passed. He looked at her. He did not move. She felt the rawness of something like an animal in her chest. She wanted to scream the way a bird screams when its wing is caught. She watched him stand and walk toward the street with the same slow, unfaltering step he had used in the alley. She walked away. Her hands were shaking so much that coins rattled in her pocket like small threats. That night the phone rang. She answered without thinking. A voice spoke into the gap between 2 breaths. It said only one thing: do not sleep. The line went dead. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch and tried to be a person who could breathe. The curtains moved when someone walked by her house. There was a shadow that stopped under the streetlight like a photograph. She could see his silhouette through the slatted blinds. He raised one hand. She could not tell if he was waving or if he was shielding his face. She did not move. The next morning there was another poster on the pole, another face. She counted the faces in her head like inventory against fear. She could not bear the thought of adding one more. The night of the escalation came without warning. There was a smell before there was a sound. Something sweet and rotten like fruit left too long in a jar. She woke to the cat hissing at the bedroom door. She reached for the lamp. The bulb flared and a shadow moved across the wall. He was at the end of the hallway the way a decision stands at the end of a choice. He walked as if he owned the dark. He had a small patch of dried mud on his shoe. Her mouth filled with a taste of metal. She ran. She ran without shoes. Her feet stung on the cold kitchen tiles. She grabbed a knife from the drawer like a prayer. He laughed quietly. His voice was the sound of a tape recorder that had been left running in a room where something terrible had happened. She hid in the pantry and listened to the scrape of his boots in her hall. He opened the pantry door and the light cut into the darkness like a film edit. He stood very close to her. She could see the faint flecks of something on his knuckles. He smelled like bread and iron. He put his hand on the shelf next to her head like a casual touch that erased margin. He dropped something into the pantry. It was a small package wrapped in brown paper. There was a single circle drawn on it with a thick black marker. She wanted to move. Every muscle screamed. She did not. He left in a slow, soft step so that the house would not notice that anything had been taken from it. When she opened the package, it was a hair ribbon and a button from a coat. She pressed them to her face until the cold fabric burned her skin. She called the police in the next morning with a voice that sounded thin even to her. They took her statement with the polite slowness of a machine. There were forms to fill. There were questions about alibis and habits. They told her to lock her doors. They told her to call if she saw anything suspicious. They left with the same set of small gestures that said, "We will do what we can." She cleaned the house with the kind of methodical violence that people use to make sense of chaos. She scrubbed floors until her fingertips were raw. She changed the locks. She put heavy bolts on the doors. She moved the furniture like a person rearranging bones. She told herself she had bought time. Time is an expensive illusion. The confrontation came in the way storms do. It arrived without any announcement that could be trusted. He knocked on her door in the evening. He knocked with an ordinary rhythm. She did not answer. He knocked again. He spoke through the door. He said a name that sounded like the name of a child learning to say a word. Her fingers tightened on the chair back. She listened to the sound of the clock on the mantel. It was a small heart keeping other small hearts in order. Then he forced the lock. He moved like someone who had practiced the geometry of entering. He pushed the door with the quiet that only some people know. She heard the scrape of boot against rug, then the smell of sweet rot like a candle guttering. He came at her like the end of a calculation. He had a blade without flourish. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed patience. She fought with everything she had. She stilled his arm. She bit the skin of his wrist until his fingers loosened. He screamed like an animal surprised by a trap. She ran with a piece of his coat in her hand. She struck him with a frying pan. The sound it made was a small cathedral bell. He fell. He did not stay down. He rose slowly, like someone who had been waiting for a long part of a long day. Blood left her temple in a warm, quiet line. She felt each second like an event with sharp edges. She thought of the faces on the telephone pole. She thought of the packages. She thought of the cat. She thought of the narrow house and the way a life could fold and then be folded. She pushed him down the stairs. He hit the railing and cursed with a voice that was almost a syllable of a prayer. She grabbed the phone and dialed. The police were there like a slow tide. They took him in handcuffs that looked too loose on a man made narrow by secrets. He did not speak. He did not make noise except for the small, sharp sounds that people make when they are losing some days of themselves. The immediate danger seemed to retreat like a tide. There were interviews. There were lights and microphones and a town that wanted its wound explained. The man sat in his cell, and in his mouth were the small teeth of whatever language people use when they have been turned inward. They showed photographs on the news that they had taken from his home. There were more faces. Objects neatly wrapped. Lists like calendars of a system that had no mercy. People murmured. People called it a monster. The man did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who had learned to be ordinary until ordinary allowed him to stop being seen. The woman who had stared at the telephone pole photographs saw the faces again on television. She pressed her palm to the screen as if touch could reorder facts. The police said they were still searching. They said they had found nothing definitive. They said there was no clear evidence linking him to some of the missing. They said there were legal limits. Their mouths made the motions of legal mouths. He sat in a cell and chewed silence like food. She watched him through a window in the station with the bitter taste of victory that tastes like ash. The town put up more lights. Neighbors installed cameras with red recording dots that blinked in the twilight. There were vigils with candles and the word missing carved into the air every time someone spoke, but the feeling of being watched shifted. If the man was a map of danger, then he was not the whole map. There were things that did not fit the neat boxes of arrest. There were records that were incomplete. There were neighbors who would not speak even after the cameras recorded them. There were nights when she woke and thought she heard the same slow footstep pattern on the street outside. She would press her ear to the pillow and then wait until the sound of her own blood became a counterpoint to the city. The legal world moved slowly like a glacier. There were hearings and then delays. Paperwork piled up like snow. The man was charged with some things. He remained eligible for bail. The idea of him walking again in the sunlight of any street made her stomach fold. Weeks later, he was released on a technicality. The prosecutor said they could not make a certain piece of evidence hold in court the way a hinge refuses to take a heavy door. The town breathed in a way that seized. He walked down Maple Street like a man on whose face the weather had been brief. He passed houses with curtains that pulled closed as he crossed. He smiled in a way that asked for nothing and took everything. She watched from behind a curtain with the small photograph in her hand. The poster faces multiplied in the corners of her mind until they blurred into a single long list. She knew that the law had limits. She also knew that small things did not. She placed a record of the packages in an envelope and mailed it to a journalist in another city. She sent it like a stone thrown into still water. She spoke the names of the missing out loud in the car when driving alone. She read them as if they were an alphabet that might banish ghosts. The resolution was not tidy. There was no single courtroom scene that cleared the air for everyone. There were no cinematic confessions. There were nights when the streetlight on Maple Street stayed off for a week and then came back with a different hum. There were rumors that the man had left town. There were rumors that he had never been alone in his work. There were whispers of other streets with their own lists of missing faces. She moved the cat to a friend for a while. She painted her front door a different color to confuse eyes that know habitual routes. She learned to sleep with lights on in the hall. She walked faster at night. Sometimes she caught herself stopping and listening to a man pass in the night. Her hands would find the kitchen drawer where the knife lived. She would breathe and remember the weight of a frying pan on a skull. Months later, she opened a folder she had kept under the floorboard. Inside were the edges of the photographs and the small packages and the hair ribbon she had taken from the pantry. She looked at the faces and tried to reconstruct lives from the smallest details. She wrote names into a notebook like someone cataloging stars. She sent the pages to people who had the habit of publishing things in public. Her actions were small and persistent like a tide. She became one of those people who knock on the doors of courts and who ask questions in hallways where answers are thin. She wore the memory of the fight like a badge that no one else could see. Her scar on the temple healed into a pale line like a tributary. It was a map that told her where she had been. And yet the end was never complete. There were nights when she would see a figure at the corner. Sometimes it was him. Sometimes it was someone else who shared the gate he had used. Sometimes it was only a shadow that her mind made because it needed enemies. The telephone pole still held photographs. Sometimes new faces appeared. Sometimes old faces were moved or taken down. The town learned to sleep in small bursts. People learned to tell stories that left holes in them on purpose like a garment with frayed edges. She did not stop moving. She did not stop looking. She learned to live with an awareness that felt like a second skin. It was never comfortable. It was practical. The final shot is not a tidy frame. It is the woman at her kitchen table late at night with a lamp on and a notebook open. Her hand moves across the page. She writes names. She will not let them be erased. Outside, a man walks by as he always has. He might be the man who once wore a smile like a borrowed coin. He might be a different shadow altogether. The streetlight hums. The cat sleeps in a place that is entirely its own. A siren fades in the distance like a promise that will not be kept. The case remained open. The town would always hold a small hush for the missing. Her life had been rearranged by events no map could have predicted. She found strength in the brittle kind of courage that comes from surviving something meant to unmake you. She kept the photograph from the pole in a folder. She pressed it between pages like one presses flowers to remember their scent. Every so often she would walk to the pole and smooth the paper with her palm. She would look at the faces. She would say their names out loud to the cold air and listen for an answer that never came. And as months became years, she understood one thing with a clarity that was as sharp as glass. The world does not end in a single night. It ends in a series of small compromises and quiet, relentless refusals. She chose the refusal. She kept awake. She stayed vigilant. The cannibal walked the street. So she watched him.